Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Jacqueline Boersma. I'm part of the Stewardship Kaleidoscope Planning team. Just a couple of quick notes and reminders for today. Immediately following the workshop this afternoon, we will enjoy a sponsor appreciation reception. So please plan to join us for some time together at 4:30 to 6 p.m. before you enjoy your free evening on your own. It is a hosted bar, so no need for tickets or cash, and we'll have some light snacks to enjoy as well. So please come and visit with our sponsors and enjoy some food and drink and fellowship. Tomorrow, we will begin with the D workshop at 9 a.m., and we will then follow that with our final plenary and closing worship. As mentioned earlier this morning, if you are part of the PCUSA Board of Pensions program and you want to get your call to health points for attending the conference, please be sure to complete the survey because the code that you'll need for the call to health points will be on that survey. And as mentioned, we look at everyone's responses, and that helps us to plan for next year. So call to health is worth 100 points for attending this week. And then as a reminder, if you have any questions, please find someone on the planning team. We are wearing tags with a red ribbon that says, "Ask Me." Now we will hear from our sponsors, and I'd like to ask Nathan Lundgren to come up and speak with us.
Thank you. Hi, friends. Well, I bring you greetings from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. You don't have to say all that, just LIRS for short is fine. We're very grateful to be ambassadors at this year's Stewardship Kaleidoscope and hope to connect with some of you, maybe at our table or perhaps at the reception later at 4:30. So about LIRS, we are the largest national faith-based nonprofit organization dedicated to serving new Americans. For almost 85 years, since 1939, we've been welcoming refugees and asylum seekers. We also reunite children with loving families, and we advocate in Washington for a more fair, functional immigration system. And we do all of this in close partnership with faith communities, many of them Lutheran, yes, hence the L in the name, but also many Presbyterians and Methodists and Catholics and evangelicals, even synagogues and mosques, really anyone who shares our commitment to welcoming the stranger. So rather than talk about it further, I'd love to give you a video taste of what it all looks like. Thank you.
All of the craziness of our lives and the things that we think define who we are stop us from seeing who God calls us. You know, that God calls us beloved, that we're loved and held and, you know, embraced by God, even though we're like messed up in so many ways. And just taking that one step, just crossing over that river and getting over that fear and saying, I'm going to go into this and see what God is calling me into.
Even as I've come into LIRS today to see what the outpouring of goods and things are from congregations just in this area, I know that across this country, we're now in a situation of also showing that same hospitality to Afghan refugees. I really hope that every congregation would consider this and expect great returns on the sense of loving the neighbor, receiving the refugee and the stranger, and watching these people contribute to life in this country.
I love the environment here. You know, with all the struggles when I came first in the United States, resettlement process, even for me, because I knew the language, was not easy. You know, the test of freedom, safety, and security hit us differently.
We are glad to be doing this ministry in partnership with LIRS, but we wish we didn't have to. And I want to acknowledge that we grieve with people who have left everything. We grieve with those of you who see your country, your homeland still in such peril. Our hearts are with you, our prayers remain with you, and we are committed to doing all we can to ensure that you and your people have a future with hope.
Welcome to the Kaleidoscope Conference. The Board of Pensions is thrilled to bring this to you in collaboration with the Presbyterian Foundation. We hope that this is an important experience for you and one that will enliven the life of your congregation. All of you are in congregations that continue to change, and taking this time to work through new ideas, hear from speakers, engage your colleagues. This is a time that we think you will find most valuable. In the board's work, we have come to the realization that we must always update and innovate. Right now, we are in a season of rebuilding. We realized that the systems we have in place are not serving the church as it exists today. Instead of all ministers being enrolled in the benefits plan, our research has shown that over the last 15 years, 30% of ministers ordained in PCUSA are receiving no benefits from us at all. That really made us stop to say, what do we need to be doing? How can we think in new and innovative ways? Part of that process has been talking to other Presbyterians. Over the last 6 months, we've met with over 600 Presbyterian leaders. We want to know their concerns, their ideas, their hopes, their dreams for the future. How might we serve all ministers who are ordained by this denomination? We did this 7 years ago for all of our lay members and have seen significant increases in the number of people who are receiving benefits. In fact, over the last 6 years, we've enrolled 4,000 new employees for benefits from the board. We are convinced the same will be true for our ministers. As you think about your work in this Kaleidoscope Conference, think about innovation. Think about how we create a culture of generosity. Think about stewardship in new ways, not just financial, although that's important, but how are we good stewards of resources, of talents, of time? All of these things will be topics that you will have an opportunity to discuss, to share. And it is in conversation, I believe, that collaboration is most effective. So welcome to Kaleidoscope. I know you're going to have a great experience here.
Hi. My name is Kyle Nolan, and I serve as the Ministry Relations Officer for this region for the Presbyterian Foundation. We're glad to be with you here today, and we're proud to be sponsors of Stewardship Kaleidoscope. I want to share with you a short film that doesn't tell our story. Instead, it tells the story of a church that we worked with in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Gateway Presbyterian Church. We walked alongside this church while they discerned what God was calling them to do. In a nutshell, that's what we do, and we can do it for your church too. I hope you enjoy the film.
What should a church do with property it no longer needs? It's a question that many congregations are facing. Gateway Presbyterian Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado owns a house that was used as a manse for several decades. Gateway members began to consider how they could honor God with good stewardship of this resource. They affectionately call it the house next door.
The general consensus was, we're not called to be landlords, but we're probably called to use that in some kind of ministry.
One morning I was reading the newspaper and I read an article saying some of the Afghans would be coming to the United States. I thought, well, here we have this big house and it'll be ready.
Hundreds of refugees have settled here, fleeing from violence, persecution, and poverty. Lutheran Family Services is the agency that helps the families settle in the area. The first step is finding them a transitional place to live. More than that, refugees need a sense of community, and that's one of the unique ways a church like Gateway can help.
They need care. They need care, they need warm hearts, they need people that understand that starting their lives all over again is extremely difficult. But what makes it easy is churches like this and partners and volunteers that we have to come alongside the families and help them and alleviate some of that pressure to know that you're not by yourself, we're here to walk with you.
Just a few months after reaching out to the agency, Victoria got the call that a family from Afghanistan needed a home in Colorado Springs. The house next door was ready. The family fled the wrath of the Taliban. The oldest son of the family had served as an interpreter for the U.S. military in Afghanistan. He immigrated to America 6 years ago. When the U.S. forces pulled out of Afghanistan, his family became targets of the Taliban. The Taliban threatened members of the family at gunpoint twice. They feared for their lives. The U.S. State Department got the family safely out of Afghanistan, and Lutheran Family Services helped them resettle in Colorado Springs. The family is learning English and how to find jobs. Church members feel a renewed sense of purpose in how God is using the house next door. They spend time with the family and invite them to church events. Through it all, they are following Christ's command to love their neighbor.
I'm really glad that we've got this opportunity because I think we did something special. I don't think there's any question about it, and it ended up being just a wonderful opportunity for us to do something really, really help people out that need help.
This church is really, truly extending grace to a culture of people that they wouldn't necessarily extend it to, but they've been given a great opportunity to do so, and I believe that God is pleased about that personally.
Their history has been the little church that could, and yet again, God has allowed them to be able to do something meaningful and life-changing.
As you hear this story, you may feel it's time to consider what to do with your church's underused property. Is your congregation being called to use your resources in new and faithful ways? The Presbyterian Foundation has worked with hundreds of churches just like Gateway and just like yours to transform their assets to creatively support mission and ministry. We are here to work with you. Reach out to us. We are here to help.
Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our third keynote speaker, Kim Dawsey-Richardson. Reverend Kim Dawsey-Richardson is the pastor of First Presbyterian Church of El Cajon in South California, where the once rural congregation founded in 1883 is now surrounded by neighbors from all over the world. Passionate about spiritual formation and community transformation, Kim longs to see the church to be a hub of connection and belonging. She serves as a leader of Welcome Ministry of El Cajon, an ecumenical outreach of worship, mercy, and justice to the immigrant, refugee, and unsheltered, where her sermons are translated into Arabic, and she enjoys breaking bread in the local park. Outdoor adventures, weightlifting, baklava, and spending leisurely time with friends and family over good food are a few of her favorite things. She lives in San Diego with her husband, 3 children, 2 dogs, and 2 guinea pigs. Please join me in welcoming Kim Dawsey-Richardson.
Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. don't be afraid. When I was asked to speak, I said, yeah, but we're just this small, ordinary church that's struggling financially, and we don't have some big success story, but we know something about generosity and abundance. And then as the months progressed, I realized there was another talk in me that I needed to give. I've been sitting with this question: how do we steward grief in times of complex change? And despite the solemn subject, I'm so glad to be with all of you in this increasingly ecumenical conference. We have Lutherans here. The outstanding Lutheran preacher Nadia Bolz-Weber said, "Preach from your scars, not from your wounds." I confess today that I'm not going to be taking her advice, and I'm going to be speaking from some open wounds. Full disclosure, all those months ago, back in January or February, Robert, I thought that some of the details of my personal story and church story would be more tidily wrapped up by now, and they're not. So I speak to you today from the messy middle. Anyone there? Anyone stuck in the messy middle? Yeah. So in John 4, Jesus and his disciples are heading to Galilee, and there's this line that says, but he had to go through Samaria. It was the faster route, but it wasn't the route that was traveled because it was so dreaded. It was an undesirable place with undesirable people that were scorned. And what we hear is that, Jesus had to go through because of God's expansive love for everyone, and also to teach the disciples a lesson, of course. But I also think that some gifts can only be given and received going through the places that we'd rather avoid. So friends, this is the story of two homes. In 2018, I felt compelled to take a new, uncertain path myself. I left my previous call of 14 years at a church where I was associate pastor with nothing lined up after because I needed soul space. Anyone feel that way? I felt a little disillusioned with the institution, but I did have these leadership and maybe lead pastoral longings in me, and I wondered if there was a place for me. A big-hearted, highly sensitive, ENFP, Enneagram 2, for those of you who know your personality typologies. Yeah, First Presbyterian Church of El Cajon was founded in 1883 in the heart of El Cajon, just east of San Diego. It is located on a perfect circle of land, right next to an Episcopalian church, a senior living facility, a huge apartment complex, homes, and 2 blocks away is downtown El Cajon. Over the years, the once predominantly white rural farming community evolved to become a multicultural city, home to refugees and immigrants from all over the world, with one of the largest Chaldean populations in the country. And with San Diego's housing crisis, people just keep moving east. The church was in decline. It had been for a while, and it was dated, right? But there was so much good. I had been told by different sources that the people here were really salt of the earth. And I found that to be true in the very best way. There was this diversity of theological and political perspectives, awareness of that, some fights over that, but also this rich embrace and beloved friendship and showing up for one another. They showed up for me with their whole hearts, and I was drawn by their honesty and their generosity of spirit and their kind warmth. And to this day, those continue to be our most valuable assets. In the bathroom, at my first in-person interview, I saw underfoot the same 1960s brown hexagon linoleum that I had in my childhood kitchen. And I just thought, oh my goodness, this place needs so much work. And it feels like home. I began as their pastor in May 2019. Yeah, this is the installation service. It's not usually that full. I just want to be honest. Our revitalization efforts began right away because we had no time to lose, and there were 3 things we needed to pay attention to: property, our preschool, and our personnel. With our property, we had to talk about financial sustainability and stewardship. We were talking about, is there any way we can potentially generate some income, but also, win-win, more fully embrace the mission of God in the neighborhood? And because we're Presbyterians and we like to form groups and committees, we formed the BMPG, the Big Mission Planning Group. And that group continues to be vibrant in its work. Our preschool at that time was struggling. It was financially reliant on the church. And there was a reboot effort in motion, and then that fell apart. And there was the decision soon after I started to close. I can't take ownership of that one. But there was great grief over that. And then personnel. Yeah, I inherited a staff, and there were some situations that needed to be navigated. And after counsel from the previous interim, the last pastor, the elders, and months of sharing and trying to find some greater alignment, we realized it would be inevitable that a staff restructure was coming. It was good, but it was really, really hard. There were challenges and so much work with this new church home, but also so much possibility. And I gotta say, it was very much the way I felt about our 1898 old beloved home. And I know that 1898 doesn't sound that old to some of you who live on the East Coast. But on the West Coast, it is very old. It was the oldest house in the neighborhood. So when my husband Jeremy and I were in our 20s and totally broke, working in non-prof, I was doing refugee resettlement, he was in homelessness, I had an uncle who helped us buy a 600 square foot bungalow. And we fixed it up over 4 years and then sold it for the same price as our dream home 2 blocks away. A charming 1898 2-story colonial craftsman money pit. It had fallen out of escrow, which is why we were able to get it, because it had been left vacant and then it was vandalized. So the copper plumbing was stripped, the stair banister had been pulled out, light fixtures were missing, but the bones, right? I mean, the molding and the built-ins and the charm. It was complicated, passing inspection, and a total dream that we got it and we treasured it. And we made it livable and fixed what we could as we raised our 3 children, hoping to restore it to its former glory someday. It was a hot mess and it was home. Sometimes we feel that way about our churches, yeah? After 12 years living in our family home, while the important gutting and rebuilding work was happening in our new church home, we were finally getting to our bigger house projects too, because with the help of my new salary and years of savings, we were able to pour $80,000 into the foundation repairs, repairing the wood floors and the old windows, and splitting one of the rooms. It really only had 2 bedrooms, so all 3 kids were staying in one. There was a triple bunk bed, and they were getting older, and it was time. And the roof was next. I remember sleeping on a mattress downstairs with all these projects happening in February 2020 because I was nervous, and it was the night before my first annual meeting. Do other denominations have this, where there's an annual meeting and the pastor has to leave and they talk about them, vote on their terms of call, and then they go back in finding out whether or not they still have a job? Yeah, I had been there 9 months. A pregnant 9 months, and I did feel like everyone wanted me to birth new life, and hopefully a lot of young families as well. And instead, I nervously announced change. And I remember there was all this excitement and support for the future, and palpable pain over the preschool and the staffing changes. And I remember thinking, oh, it's too much, too fast. But then within 1 month, we would enter lockdown for a global pandemic, and change would become our new norm and take on a complexity and life of its own. I will call March 2020 to March 2021 the great blur. We all know the blur. We know about the sickness and the death and the polarizing politics. We know about the loneliness, and then for others of us who were living with too many verbal processors under one roof, the insanity. We know about live streaming and Zoom and YouTube. Our church didn't own a video camera when pandemic happened. And our beloved old house that had hosted so many people in ministry gatherings and events over the years now hosted church. One of our congregants took this screenshot, which felt like my new norm as I earnestly prayed with my worship helpers in the background. There's a lot of this, a lot of good humbling that happened. Our old home, you see our old diamond windows and the coffered ceilings and the nooks. We really had fun. That was Palm Sunday. We kept rearranging space and trying to set up, like be real sophisticated with the sheet, and so the shadows were right. That was for a special event, and then gathering flowers for Easter. And then there's the family. There's my husband, Jeremy, my boys, Elliot and Amos, and my baby girl, Avila. Eventually, new movements in ministry formed despite COVID or due to COVID. Like we got new equipment and an audiovisual team. We moved prayer virtually, which still helps our homebound. We experimented with outdoor church. Our BMPG, that big mission planning group, gained momentum and had all these meetings with builders and asked questions about low-income housing and ground leases, and new ideas were birthed. We increased ministry with our neighbors, St. Albans Episcopal Church, sharing our parking lot for Ash Wednesday services and serving our neighbors more faithfully together. Soon after our preschool closed, Head Start moved in, and they were serving the poorest of the poor in our neighborhood in alignment with our mission. And we started having these intense conversations that were important about racial justice, about the rising numbers of the unsheltered in our community. And then we became a Matthew 25 church, which is a PCUSA movement committed to building congregational vitality, dismantling structural racism, and eradicating systemic poverty. And that focused us. By the end of 2020, I had pastored longer online than in person. And there were hardships, but I was really, really so proud of the resilience. I kept saying, the church is not a place, it's a people. Any of you say that? Yeah, the church is not a place you go to, it is a people you belong to. And I kept pushing this. And pushing this unknown future and how we need to hold our programs and our property more loosely. None of it is ours. It is all God's. April 2021 felt like the epicenter of new beginnings. There was so much anticipation for both homes, our church home and our family home. Personally, we resumed the delayed house projects that we had postponed a year, and we were getting a new roof. We had been intentional to support a smaller business led by people of color. They were just starting out, but these roofers already had 5-star reviews and they were doing good work. The whole world was opening up. The timeline is still etched in my mind. April 4th was Easter, and we had a live stream and a sunrise service, and we were practicing for people coming back into our sanctuary a couple of weeks later. The week of April 12th, the kids went back to school, hallelujah. The week of April 18th, we reopened our sanctuary after over a year of worshiping online and outside. And 48 hours later, on Tuesday, April 20th, I was watching the news in between all of my meetings because it was the day that Derek Chauvin was convicted of the murder of George Floyd right here in Minneapolis. And the verdict was announced. And we were all so emotional by this taste of justice And I remember I got a call from my friend, my neighbor, who was black, who we had been following all of this together and talking about it. And we had texted extensively. She didn't usually call. I assumed it was about that. And I picked up my phone excitedly and I said, "Sophia, how are you?" And her voice dropped. And she said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm great. Did you see the verdict?" And I started rambling, and she just stopped me and said, Kim, I'm standing in front of your house on fire." One of the roofers had an open torch on a flat part of the roof without any backup or an extinguisher, and it was one spark that flew into one crack, and our old blown-in insulation just went up into flames. I had missed my husband's calls. He was home. He got the dogs out. And then he watched as 24 firefighters showed up and analyzed and strategized how to preserve this old home. I got the kids, and we had that hard, unpredictable talk of, we don't know what's next. We don't know if it's small or if it's major. And they bravely said, "No, let's go face it." And so we arrived, and the firefighters were still working. And my husband was just standing on the side of the road with the 2 dogs and a bunch of bottles of whiskey. It was like a living country song. The firefighters had, made these runs into the house, and one of the times one came out and he found my husband's expensive booze, and he opened up his coat and said, "I think you're gonna need this later." Man, moments of loss are strange. They speed up and slow down, and then the most interesting details cement in our memories. I remember the devastation on the roofers' faces and pastorally comforting them and embracing them in my arms and saying, "It's okay. It was just an accident. We're all alive. We both have insurance." I remember the drive-by fire chasers handing us their business cards, and a hysterical neighbor that I had never met who wouldn't stop crying. And then as texts and calls came in, it was, of course, one of our Iraqi families at church who insisted that our entire family come and stay with them as long as we needed to. Maybe they knew something about that. And meanwhile, the insurance company relocated us to a hotel that was too far away, and another friend showed up and took our dogs, and I got the kids settled in a hotel while my husband went to Target and bought toothpaste and deodorant and pajamas. The firefighters were amazing, and they had gone in and asked us some questions. So they got our wedding album and my nice winter coats and our upright piano, and we just thought, it's fine, it's all salvageable. This is how it first started, and then we realized how trashed the upstairs was when the whole roof burned off, and they had to put water and fire retardant foam into our house for over an hour. And so within days, black mold climbed the walls and the lead was everywhere. We as a family snuck in, right? This is the question, right? If you had to lose everything, what 3 items could you rescue? And we knew. We had to get Avila's baby blanket that she slept with every night and the 2 13th books. These were books we gave both of our boys when they turned 13 with art and pictures and prayers and these huge compilations from their community as they entered adolescence. And so we went in and we dug, and then you find these other treasures. Do we have any Parks and Rec fans out there? This is the delightful Funko Pop Ron Swanson doll that we found after he reconnects with his ex Tammy and somehow ends up in prison with cornrows. That was fun to recover. And then this charcoal portrait it was drawn by my father and priceless to us. That's the 13th book. We got it. And we got the baby blanket, forever gray with burn marks on it, but after 15 washes, good as new. They were such disorienting and euphoric days, to have had this thing happen and and all I had was ill-fitting underwear from Target, and yet everything was fine. I didn't take the time that I needed because the church had literally just reopened the Sunday before, and I remember a friend brought me a dress at my hotel room, and I went and I preached the next day, trying to comfort congregants, and I made a weird joke about the gospel spreading like wildfire, and it was like, everybody was like traumatized for me. It was terrible. We were told 6 to 12 months, and I thought, okay, after all this, I got another hard year in me. Spoiler, it was not a year. It was not a year. But my house journey awakened me to the complicated losses connected to our larger or more visible losses. You know, the thing behind the thing. And really, death can be simple and beautiful. I mean, sometimes somebody dies and it was time. And what needed to be said was said, and there's this rejoicing. Occasionally, a church dies this way, knowing that it was faithful and good, and now it's closing with the proceeds going to 10 new ministries. But often grief is complicated, and we know this. You know, a parent dies, and it's not only the grief over that loss, but then the old sibling rivalry that implodes again, and all the logistics and paperwork and surprises in the will and houses to go through. There are these layers we need to hold. And I think about this when someone at church seems disproportionately upset about or attached to something. You know, our folks aren't only grieving the loss of a leader or a ministry or a style of music or how a room was once used, but a whole past time that represented comfort and security and a sense of identity and belonging, even if they can't name that. And I feel like, gosh, globally, we're holding all of these layers of unprocessed grief. Within days after our fire, we found out that our roofers had let their insurance lapse during COVID. And I couldn't shake that we would be fine, that we were privileged homeowners in San Diego. But I lost sleep over the roofers and their livelihood and their business, knowing that now our insurance was taking over and probably going to go after them. And I thought, is this it? One guy makes one mistake? So much loss. And then meanwhile, for months, we were the recipients of all these gifts, especially from our dear loving church. You know, meals and wine, so many bottles of wine, and gift cards, sometimes partial used. It was like $2.82. It was like they just emptied their pockets and gave us their old raincoats and their thermoses, and they just kept giving us these gifts. And so I struggled, in contrast, to sit with my pain in light of the bigger needs and the suffering all around. I knew we wouldn't go a day without food or shelter, which is nothing compared to the ongoing impact of racism or what our world's 110 million refugees face. And I didn't know how to hold that and hold how vulnerable I felt, because the insurance system turns out to be incredibly complicated and hard to navigate, and I speak English and had tons and tons of help. And it made me sick thinking about people who are navigating all of these systems, the immigration and legal system, the mental health system, the medical system. As I look at my dear coworker who has spent the better part of a year and a half navigating those systems to find safety and refuge for one of our unhoused neighbors. Amidst my grief resistance, our personal losses continue to grow. We just assumed that we would be able to rebuild, and then you find out the thing. It's always the water, right? It was the water damage that was so severe and exposed all these major structural issues. At month 4, it was declared a total loss, but it would take another 10 months for demolition. Now, I know that, it's never a good time to lose your house. But in post-COVID world, with the insurance process clogged, especially in California, with agents overloaded from wildfires and permitting backed up and fluctuating labor and lumber costs, it would demand more time and money than we could have fathomed, and it put us in a very precarious financial situation. My husband had to go back to work full time, and he had been kind of taking care of everything on the home front so I could pastor. And we're so grateful for his new job, but it required all this travel, which was another major transition for our family. And then in all the waiting, the house sat vacant again and was more vandalized again as our unhoused neighbors repeatedly broke in looking for shelter, which impacted our beloved, long-suffering neighbors. And I lost more sleep worrying about the air, because you needed like a hazmat suit to go in there. And when we'd check on the house, we'd find drugs, and then once we found a barbecue in our living room. And I thought, oh my goodness, this house is gonna burn down again, and there's gonna be loss of life this time. And then one of our kids struggled, especially, in distinct and growing ways, exhibiting behaviors that led us to ask a different set of questions. 8 months after the fire, we got his autism diagnosis at age 15, and I went into deep grief. And it's not over ASD, autism spectrum disorder, because there is magic and beauty and awesomeness in that. I went into grief because we didn't know earlier, even though we had known something, and we had him in years of therapy and working to regulate emotions and talking with the school. No one had flagged him with neurodivergence. And this learning process and navigating that system, man, has been just as stretching as our house journey, but not something that I've been able to share on a public scale. He did give me permission to share it with all of you. And then a month after that diagnosis, after finally settling into a new neighborhood and getting some loaner furniture, our landlords had their own crisis, right? The layers and layers of loss. And they needed to move back into the house, and we needed to move again, which was especially hard for my kid who needed to know a game plan for the future. Finally, after many more complicated months, after a year, it was February of this year, after insurance negotiations and demo and architects and permitting, we broke ground. And then it was halted 4 days later because of concern about the clay. I know we live in San Diego, but there was a lot of rain this year, which meant foundation issue problems all over the county and litigations, and no one was taking any chances. And so in the end, it would cost us $65,000 for structural and soil engineers and the tests and reports and machinery to recompact our lot. And so I have another talk that's called Building a Firm Foundation and the Parables of Jesus and Expansive Soil. Not really. Yeah. It's not lost on me that as I preached surrender and change and holding our buildings more loosely, because the church is not a place, it's a people, all I wanted was our old broken home back. But reflecting on our family's layers of loss and disappointment and unmet expectations, it gave me this new lens with which to understand and compassionately hold the losses and grief of others. Coming out of COVID, there was so much worry about money and attendance. There was this real sadness over who hadn't returned, and our youth group falling apart, and how small our choir now was. It was down to 5 people, and how we couldn't find a part-time choir director or an organist. And then there were more staffing changes as 3 employees moved out of state because of California prices. Time would resolve some of these issues, but not all. And I found that it was really hard for folks to rebound after such prolonged immobility and mental health impact. You know, there was and there remains this disorienting loss that is physical, and it's mental and emotional and spiritual. Do we all feel that? Can we all acknowledge that? Our people for so long kept asking, where is everyone? And so we finally just looked at the numbers. Since I've arrived, a little over 4 years ago, we have had 38 deaths. The majority of them happened after lockdown, right? An older congregation. We've had 12 moves and another 12 others who I think were upset for one thing or another, especially when we were taking some stands on behalf of our neighbors. We only averaged between 130 and 140 before the pandemic. So our church felt this. And there was good news. I mean, 40% of our congregation is now new from just the last few years, the majority since COVID. And I've found that our folks are excited and welcoming new faces and welcoming new initiatives so long that everything was returns, right? There's this underbelly of unspoken grief and clinging. The great leadership guru Ronald Heifetz once said, "What people resist is not change per se, but loss." Well, yeah, but the doozy is that every change requires loss, right? I asked my kid on the spectrum, can you experience any change without loss? Knowing he would run through a Rolodex of scenarios and then announce no. Even a change that appears to be an addition or a good requires the loss of a past rhythm, the loss of energy, the loss of another way of being. And I agree. So how do we steward grief? I don't know that I have all the answers. But I want to share just some of what I've learned and recognized. And I just want to say there are great grief theories out there. And some of you can come up to me after and say, oh, you were in denial at this part and in anger at this part. And that hasn't really informed this. There's also an actual medical diagnosis called complicated grief. And I'm not speaking to that, although there might be overlap. I'm sharing personally, and I guess I'll start by saying, I have needed to let go of grieving perfectly. I don't know if that resonates with anyone out there, but I have needed the grace that others extended me that I wasn't extending to myself. Fellow leaders, we are grieving so many losses, and then we have to step up to a mic or make decisions, or help our family, or lead stewardship campaigns in the midst of our own exhaustion and our own flickering hope while we're trying to be like a dancing beacon of hope, and sometimes we feel like frauds. And sometimes ministry can feel more forced than faithful. And I just want to say good grief, because life is beautiful and terrible. We are all grieving all kinds of losses and all kinds of change. I mean, ongoing change, layers of change. So may we be gentler with ourselves for whoever needs to hear that. I know that I expended way too much energy wishing that I was more grounded and less stressed, and it wasn't helpful to my journey. What has been helpful in stewarding grief has been paying attention to the patterns with questions, with some curiosity. You know, churches have personalities all their own and patterns. We have particular patterns that are embedded in us. You ever have those moments when you're like, nah, I worked out that character flaw all those years ago, or that old childhood wound is gone, and then you're like, what in the world? We are back here again? Yeah, the great monk and theologian, Father Thomas Keating, he's the one who coined the expression emotional programs of happiness to describe how humans instinctually meet legitimate needs in illegitimate ways. So real, true, God-given needs in this hustling, unhelpful way. And he talks about 3 archetypal ways that humans seek to pursue happiness and meet these needs. They are 1, power and control, 2, through esteem and approval, and 3, through safety and security. So when we feel vulnerable, these default patterns emerge, right? Psychological and spiritual circles talk about dying to the false self. The Apostle Paul called it the old self. And so we might find that we are like powering up and working harder to avoid feeling out of control. Or we may look to others for feedback, for affirmation. Am I okay? Am I loved? We may develop plans to prevent more pain, to feel more safe and secure in an unpredictable context. I think that for people of faith, these unconscious operating systems mask deeper questions of the divine that we must face. Is God really in control? Will God really provide and take care of us? And what does God think of us? Are we loved? Given my patterns, it wasn't that hard for me to lose my stuff. I don't usually struggle with feeling secure or safe. It was really hard for me to sort through my sense of privilege and over-responsibility. It was really humbling and hard to receive so many gifts. It was hard to feel so needy when I wanted to have it all together for my family and my church. It was a time, I wish it was over, but it's not quite, where there was this immense surge of insecurity as I scrambled for approval. Am I doing okay? Am I doing okay? And then in time, these deeper currents of anger and rage over all that I couldn't control and the injustices around me and all I couldn't control in our process and in our timeline and how it impacted my kiddos. You know, I felt very much like this was terrible timing as a pastor and mom of 3 kids during these years. We entered the pandemic with children, and then we left the pandemic with teenagers, which is its own message, right? Yeah. I didn't have the time or energy for this. But judging myself or just indulging my grievances kept me stuck in these mental loops. Paying attention to the patterns with some openness, noticing what was pinging my deepest places of vulnerability, and then daring to bravely welcome these feelings of shame, these feelings of anger with Christ, who knows something about suffering, who knows something about death and burial and resurrection. Yeah, that was what helped. I also learned that to steward grief, I had to name the loss and name it without spiritual bypassing or minimizing or just indulging. Spiritual bypassing is when we, use spirituality to avoid what we really need to do. It's minimizing things and saying, "Oh, God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason." I didn't fall prey to that, but man, I went deep into the comparisons, which only disconnects us from one another, when actually pain can be a great, great connector. I minimized our losses, which then just built up my suffering, and then it always leaks out sideways, if you know what I mean. I did to myself what we try not to do to our kids, where we're like, "Oh, you don't like dinner? Well, there are kids all over the world who would love to have dinner tonight." It was like in this moment of loss, I abandoned my own theology about God's economy, where I deeply believe that there is enough for all. And that means there's also space for all suffering, small and large. My suffering doesn't diminish yours. In God's economy, there is space for both. And there is space for every gift, small and large. Despite having a less evolved consciousness, the ancients were really good at naming loss and seeing God in the middle of loss. Places were named, people were named, reflecting what they were experiencing. Jacob's on the run for his life, and he ends up in a territory where he doesn't know if God will protect him, and falls asleep and has this dream and wakes up and names it Bethel, house of God, because the Lord was in this place and I didn't know it. And then soon after, Leah, right, who just wanted the love of her husband. And almost every child she bears reflects that name. Levi means God bonds. And it's because she said, "I just wish my husband loved me, and maybe God will bond me with him this time." Oh my gosh, the sadness of that. The ancients would name loss with what they said and how they named experiences and what they wore and where they went. Our lives are so busy, and we have to pause to let our hearts catch up with what is happening. And sometimes we have to go back to name things. We were informed that the demolition of our house was happening the same morning as our son's 8th grade graduation. And my husband and I decided to go alone. We sped over. We thought it would be like days, right? It was 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And then we drove over and had this celebration, and for days after, my irritability grew, and I started snapping, and I had to sit with the reality that cracking wood kept replaying in my mind, and allow myself to just be sad about that, because we can't surrender what isn't acknowledged. It helped me to name specific losses in our house, even though it felt trivial in light of the world's suffering. But I couldn't get out without going through. So I had a name that I really missed: our quarter bath. We had a beautifully tiled glass door with a sink. I don't know why, it wasn't practical. We will not have that in our next house, but I miss that silly quarter bath that we really cherished. I miss our windows, our gorgeous windows, those heavy weighted wood windows with pre-depression glass that you got to get like a craftsman in to come and pull the whole thing apart and fix it. And Title 24 in California has all these energy efficiency standards. We can't even move in now without solar, and that is good. It is good for our planet, and I celebrate that. And I also had to name that doesn't discount that there is a beauty and a skill and a history that we need to part with. And then we found that some losses are so difficult to name because they're elusive. Among our greatest losses was not the loss of stuff, but the reverse, which is if we had only lost the garage. The garage was detached and was fine, and all the junk in it was fine. So one of the gifts of a fire is all the freedom from like having less stuff. And the whole family felt this. And it was this wild contrast to the burden and the weight of lugging all that junk around from our garage that we still have to go through. Another way that I have found critical in stewarding grief is grief rituals. And many years ago when I spent time in West Africa, I was so taken with how when somebody died, there wasn't only a service, there was 24 hours of wailing. There were days of public grief, of visits, of meals, of songs, of tears. In some cultures, people wear black for a whole year. And here, at least in my culture and where I'm from, even with the greatest losses of life, grief is often unmarked and solitary. And I think this is really where the church helps, and not just for the memorial service, hoping the family has one, but for all the ongoing connection and conversation and support. We need each other now more than ever. And we have a great liturgical calendar, I think, to help support this. So when I started, I introduced salt bowls during this season of Lent. It's a practice that a pastor friend in Oakland had done. And the salt was poured into a little bit of water as a symbol of our tears, our cries to God on behalf of everything going on in us, everything going on in the world. And then, like week 1 of Lent, we all were driven home. And I told our folks to gather bowls in their houses with a little water, and every time they walk past it, pour salt in and watch as the salt crystallizes over the side, and there are all these layers symbolizing our tear and our expectancy that God will do something and God will show up. I was delighted to find that some of our congregants kept their salt bowls going the whole duration of pandemic. This is one of the salt bowls when we were back in church together. I'll tell you, after 4 years, this last Lent, week 2, our different stations of salt bowls were full. It was like in recent years, they would just like sprinkle the salt, and now they knew. And people just were like courageous. We had to buy so much more salt because the people were in this habit and talked about how this tangible, visceral demonstration help them to practice something that they were living inside. At church, we have been asking how to honor the past and embrace the future. It's a phrase that the Presbytery Foundation gifted us. And that has led me to wonder about what other markers and rituals can we use to steward grief. Sally, one of our great matriarchs, 92 years old, she just moved into a retirement community, leaving her beautiful home with gorgeous views, but there's always a thing under the thing. It wasn't just a beautiful home. 5 decades ago, her young husband died unexpectedly in the night. And Sally was suddenly a single mom and pulled herself together, eventually sold that home, bought the new one she was living in, forged a career for herself in which she became the principal of one of the first desegregated schools in San Diego. And then later, married again, and when he died, it was in that house. This house had so much victory and meaning and stability and refuge for over 5 decades. And so talking with Sally, I suggested we have a memorial service for the house, to honor all that the walls had heard, all the arguments, all the games of bunco, all the prayers, and how it had been a refuge to her. She's thinking about it. And in speaking that, I realized, oh my goodness, that is what I need. I need a memorial service for my house to process my own grief. And I asked my clergy friends if they would do that for me. I know that I've shared a lot of the terrible with you, but the story of these 2 homes is hemmed in by the beautiful. There is layered grief, and there are just layers and layers of gifts too. And so yes, I say good grief, but also good gifts, right? Good gifts. They go hand in hand. Some gifts are only given and received going through unwelcomed places. And so if one invitation has been to steward grief attentively and intentionally, the other has been for us to recognize and receive these gifts. And I think that part of maturing and growing into greater Christ-likeness is learning to hold the great both ands of our lives, right? The giving and the receiving, the beautiful and the terrible. The beautiful and the terrible that's not just out there, but that is in us. And in this process of letting go and dying to self, we often discover how desperately we are dying to live. And then once emptied, we're finally open to God's abundance and the gifts that have been there all along. When Jesus sat down with that nameless Samaritan woman in the heat of day, when she went because no one else would be there and she could be alone with her shame and her water, he names her story, her grief, the multiple husbands and all the societal implications, and he names the gift of God. Both are true. She names their differences and compares. He names a new reality. And then this open-hearted, courageous woman not only hears about God's welcome and abundance, but shares it. It turns out she is a gift. And then the town receives her word and it invites Jesus and his companions to stay longer, and they do. There are a lot of social services and churches that talk about asset mapping. Do we know what asset mapping is? Where instead of fixating on the problems of a place, you go in with an eye out for the strengths and the beauty and the gifts, and you describe them and usually visually identify them geographically on a map. I think asset mapping was happening here. I think that we need to asset map our own lives. I think that this isn't just a story about Jesus loving the rejected Samaritans enough to bring the gospel to them. This is a story about how this dreaded place that no one wants to go through, like our grief, like our losses, like our insecurities, and fill in the blank, tend to be the very places where assets, and healing and hospitality and gifts abound, but they had to go through. This is the section of my talk that I had to trim back because the gifts, God has just really been showing off, and there's too many to name. Let me share a few, though. The gifts born of people come to mind most immediately. The gifts born of people. I know there's so much bad news out there, and there's so much scarcity thinking, but my goodness, I've seen the goodness of people from a neighbor we didn't know who took time off work and showed up with a shovel to dig through ash, literally, to the serendipity of our new landlord who had been through great loss himself and was moving, happened to be one of the firefighters who put out our fire and has been gracious and flexible in this season. From the very beginning, man, the church just showed up for us. And I felt what we dream all of our churches will be for others in the neighborhood, a safe refuge, and that's what I want for everyone. But it wasn't just our local church, it was the wider church. The Sunday after the fire, our stated clerk showed up with a hug and a check and connected me to the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Grant. That was a great support to us. Other churches and pastors reached out and connected in prayer. And I've been just amazed, not just on a personal family level, but all the gifts born of people at church. And sometimes I've wondered, is it because they know they have a beat up pastor right now that everyone's like stepping it up? But they are stepping it up. From an artist at church who was asked to take over bulletin art, but now has developed this whole community of artists that are enhancing worship and now doing art galleries and finding this whole new way of formation. To congregants who are showing up at local town hall meetings to advocate for the marginalized, to the new and loving and interesting staff that God has mysteriously stitched together, including a psychologist who was originally from Puerto Rico but has been a community organizer at the U.S.-Mexican border for the last 15 years, but wants to work with us, and a retired public school math teacher who's sitting in the front row here, who is discovering her second career in ministry. And to our great surprise, we did hire a highly trained choir director who wasn't dissuaded by the low pay or part-time hours because she had served so many big, wealthy, powerful churches. And she wanted to be in a place without pretense. I quote, "A church where people are valued more than their vocal range." And it's doubled in size and continues to grow. The surprises, right? Gifts abound. The choir is back. Can't believe it. As a community, we have also become attentive to the gifts born of circumstance. You know, how change and loss has led us to pursue and steward new possibilities. Things that started during pandemic have, in a really fascinating way, continued to grow and evolve, and we're so thankful. These conversations that we initially had around racial injustice have continued to bloom, and now we have this thing, Courageous Conversations, that we reconvene every so often. We've also been talking about the social ills, including rising homelessness in our neighborhood. The other picture is something that started during pandemic when we realized our unhoused neighbors really needed some protein and beefier snacks. Those are our protein packs, and that has led to bigger conversations, and now the formation of a working group on homelessness that is gathering with other organizations and the county to provide better services. During that time, we reached out to the Presbytery Foundation, who provided resources and a retreat that helped us to clarify our values and our Matthew 25 focus. And since then, we have engaged asset mapping. And we've developed all these dream teams that have become implementation teams. And our refugee and immigrant housing implementation team proposed that our largest meeting space, where everything happens, be remodeled and become an apartment for a family. And our elders said yes, but we didn't have any money. So we're just applying for grants, y'all. We are just applying for grants at this point, and we got a great big grant from the Synod to help. It was one of those projects that I was hoping to show off before you today, but it has taken more time and money than we anticipated. We know that road, and we also know that if God is in it, it will happen. And there are so many hidden gifts in these circumstances that we don't welcome. I mentioned Head Start moving in, which is federally funded and serving our neediest families. They just signed a 10-year lease. So I want to be honest, we are running a significant deficit budget. There is great worry about Head Start closing the gap. And we're going to hold the both and. We need to have conversations about our budget and our buildings. And can we pause long enough to say thank you? Thank you, God, for this financial gift. Thank you for how it has helped us. There remains great sadness over how few children and young families we have at church. But I would say a hidden gift of this circumstance is that it's prompted new conversations around multi-generational and neighborhood ministry. And so our folks would say, but these kids aren't ours, except that little girl. She's mine, and she's in all the photos. But the other kids aren't ours. But what does that even mean? I think we're learning to ask, well, who are our kids? These are the kids of the neighborhood that come to our joint vacation Bible school with the Episcopal Church and come to our midweek program. I think we're looking for new ways to connect in a space beyond our church walls. Just a week ago, the leaders of our midweek program arranged for the children to go across the street to the senior living facility to have dinner together. And all these new friendships were born between the young and the old. And then there are the gifts born of creativity. I will say that our church is not actively dying, but it has the potential to die. We technically have 175 members, 100 on a Sunday. Our budget is under $500,000. We have minimal endowments, very little savings, and a needy building. But as we continue to follow Christ and commit to focusing on mission, not money, I've noticed that there's been no poverty of imagination. In fact, there's been this growing sense of, what do we have to lose? And so we're experiencing more creativity. And we've noticed that we experience more of that the more we embrace difference. And we're noticing these shifts, and maybe you've noticed all the interesting shifts in your churches. There's been some increased congregational diversity, and it's not just socioeconomic. It's also folks that are coming from other streams of Christianity. Like we have some former charismatics. We have a retired Baptist pastor, a group of Methodists, a Lutheran couple, a missionary couple from Indonesia, and now a growing Spanish-speaking expression of our church. And I think rather than saying, oh, good, they are joining us, we're asking, how is it us? And how are they changing us and enhancing us? How are we changing to reflect what is? And so we're playing with language and interpreting different parts. Every week now, the Lord's Prayer is spoken loudly in Arabic and Spanish and English. We're having our second taquiza soon, which is like the most delicious taco bar to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And we're continuing to change the way that we celebrate, the way that we communicate with one another to reflect this. I think we've also really learned to embrace the creativity of collaboration because we are stronger together and we need each other now. It was mentioned that we are a partner of Welcome Ministry, this ecumenical outreach of justice and mercy to the immigrant, refugee, and unsheltered in East County. But what wasn't said is that it is funded primarily by the ELCA, hosted by the Episcopalians, and now primarily organized and led by the Presbyterians. So a few years ago at Kaleidoscope, when it was in San Diego, that offering was taken for Welcome. It was given to the Lutherans who gave it to Welcome, and a truck was purchased. And that truck now for years has been picking up pallets and pallets of food week after week to feed so many that need it. So when you heard Reverend Gilo talk about the Foundation of Life last night and the African National Ministry, man, let's pour out our pockets because we might be able to buy a truck or even something greater. The Circle Community Garden is one of our projects. And that too is something that's ushering new questions. Again, my daughter spray painting, not the trash can, but our head usher. And then there's Cindy sitting in the front row. And Cindy's begun to ask, with this community garden that we oversee, what does it look like to not just manage plots, but to develop the voices and the empowerment of what do they want? How can they become leaders? How can we bring this community with so many nationalities together to be something safe and beautiful together? And there's our church. Oh, that's Sally, 92, in the front row, gardening. The story of the two homes continues through the messy middle, and we don't know what will happen. What we know is that the way is harder and longer and way more expensive than we wanted. But the grace and the gifts are also so much more transformative and boundless. I have challenged my congregation to consider how we might better steward our space, our land and our buildings and our time and our abilities and our tears and all that we have, and to hold it all loosely with open hearts as we discern God's invitations for the future. And annoyingly, this has forced me to practice what I preach. And so when our house was torn down, we had our garage torn down too. And initially, for financial reasons, we decided not to rebuild it. And now, with a longing for more simplicity, we're gutting all that stuff to determine what's really needed and be freed from the rest. I wonder if that's the journey that our churches are on. Instead of striving to restore our home to its old glory and building it the same, we instead found an architect that listened to our longing to honor the past and embrace the future. And I have to confess, I was preaching Revelation when the plans are being drawn up, and I kept talking about the healing and the open gates and the rivers of the waters of life all converging. And there was no tree of good and evil, just a tree of life. I wanted the soul of our house to continue, but with intentionality around hospitality and connection with creation. And that architect used the footprint of our old house, deconstructed and reconstructed, around an open courtyard where we will plant a tree. That's what you see there, is that middle courtyard. And then there's my daughter with our beloved next door neighbor, Andres. They are counting down the days until they can be neighbors again. 2.5 years and counting. And we did have that memorial service just a little over a week ago. And there are my clergy pals ushering in the time. And we gathered. People were encircling that open courtyard and hanging out of all the open spaces. And we named and we remembered and we laid down what was. But it was really, truly a celebration of life as family and friends and elders and congregants gathered. And then they were all given Sharpies and they spread out through the house and they wrote prayers and blessings and some really good humor on the walls. Here's my daughter already playing in her room, and my son that sometimes doesn't like hugs, being embraced by his best friend, and then welcoming his brother into that embrace. Friends, we are held in love. And for all of us, stewardship isn't about stuff. It's about life, all of life, and it's about holding and honoring all of life, the beautiful and the terrible, and trusting God with this depth of abundance that is for all of us. Even as I continue to live through the grief of loss, I leave you with this. The great part about losing your house is losing all your stuff. The great part about losses at church is we have nothing left to lose.